Okay, here we go.
Well, Dr. Mestenhauser, we've been talking a bit about curriculum and faculty and mindsets, and I'm wondering, what can faculty do to help internationalization within the curriculum?
Well, to change their own mindsets would be the point. You know, there are two dimensions of it. You know, one is disciplinary, and the other one is more general. And maybe a third one is a mindset about the nature of higher education. For example, if the faculty say that the only learning takes place in the classroom, you know, he or she would then ignore study abroad, for example, the presence of international students in his own classroom, you know, for example, and so on. So that's kind of a mindset, and it's not all mindset about international affairs. But people are prejudiced, of course, and the mindsets are results of those kinds of prejudices. You know, one of them is that you really don't need to understand any individual culture if you understand globalization. You know, so that's one of the problems, and I think in international education we seem to be feeling that the need for understanding at least one culture intimately is essential to it. But not just understanding each culture, but understanding the cultural dynamics that are the variables of that culture, so that you can apply that to studying other cultures. That was one of the problems we had with the Peace Corps returnees, incidentally.
Right.
You know, at that time the government was asking us to help employ them, and we have employed 2 or 3 of them, and they were a disaster, because their frame of reference was based on what they experienced in the southern Philippines, and applied that to everybody, because they didn't understand the cultural principles. You know, rather they assumed that knowledge of some specifics would transfer to other people, and it certainly did not. And I had a lot of difficulties with that, and unfortunately they all came from social work. So, you know, social work then, you know, would be the field, you know, that I think should be internationalized, but I don't see much effort, you know, in that direction, which is unfortunate, because our dean is a social worker by academic training, and I have not heard her say one thing publicly about the importance of international education. So that gets back to the leadership again to as such. Mindsets, of course, are something that are needed to be studied. You know what they are, because we don't know the source of the mindsets often. And it's not just Americans who have the mindsets, you know. I don't mean to be just critical of our own culture and people and so on, and I think international students have the same kinds of mindsets, and I have worked enough with groups of international students, the Arabs, the Indians, for example, the Iranians and so on. They had organized themselves, and I saw the culture there. You can just cut it, you know, thick culture, you can just cut it with a knife, and so it was very unusual, even when, like, the Iranian students were divided between those who supported the Shah and the ones who opposed him too. So they had that opposition based not on the kind of merits that you would expect, you know, from a Western culture, but on the basis of their own biases that they acquired at home. These mindsets, of course, mostly come from media. And the reason why they are dangerous is because they are not encouraging thinking. They are encouraging mindsets are on a pilot basis, autopilot. And so when something happens, you know, the autopilot kicks in. And that's very unfortunate, you know. An Austrian scholar by the name of Liedesmann just published a book which in English would be translated something like the nature of ignorance, or something like that, or The Power of Ignorance, something about that too.
Mm-hmm.
And he traces people's ignorance basically to the media. You know, that they tell you what to think about, you know.
Mm-hmm.
If something happens, there is immediately a panel who tells you what the people said, what they didn't say, what they should have said, what that means, and so on.
Right.
So the thinking is done for us. And he's, you know, obviously he's a professor of philosophy at the Vienna University in Vienna too. And he received a major prize from the Austrian government as the best book of the year about 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And the book has been translated into many languages now, but not in English, unfortunately. There doesn't seem to be any publisher who is interested in ignorance. And but I got the Czech language translation version too.
Yeah.
And also then somebody sent me the German version, and I was very pleased to see that the translation was quite accurate. And that's one of the problems when you deal with concepts, you know, and translate into other languages out here.
Yeah.
Mindsets are more than attitudes, and when psychologists study them, they assume they are attitudes, and they would ask specific questions and make conclusions based on these questions. But they are deeply held maps, cognitive maps, you know, that tell you who our friends are, who our enemies are, you know, whom we should support, whom we should not support, and so on.
Yeah.
So these kinds of mindsets are the ones that need to be debated, and that you know, somehow they should be changed. You know, the mindsets may be necessary anyway too, but I think we need different kinds of mindsets then too, including mindsets about higher education. You know, who are the lazy students in your class? You know,
Right.
You know, how you think you can really identify them. But most faculty do categorize students that way.
Sure.
It's an A student, B student, C student, and so on. And that's rather unfortunate because we don't really know our students.
Right.
And we do need to know them a little better. And you know, when I was teaching, I always had a questionnaire, the first class, asking students who they are and what they wanted me to know, and processing that with them to at least have some minimum knowledge about who they were and where they were coming from.
Yeah. Do you mind if I ask you a question about this? I mean, I'm deeply interested in how these mindsets are overcome in education. What would you suggest in terms of curriculum, or in terms of maybe activities? Because it sounds like there may be some metacognitive components as well as cultural learning components.
Yeah. Well, you know, the answer is if we taught critical thinking adequately enough, you know, that would change their minds, because at some point people would be, you know, suddenly confronted with something else.
Yeah.
So the best way is to introduce situations that are different from those mindsets. You know, quite often I would assume that study abroad would be one such situation.
Right.
But it's not always true necessarily. I think I may have told you about the business school students who went to China and recorded in their journals, you know, the same stuff. So they reinforced the ideas that China is the enemy.
Right.
And that's a mindset.
Yeah.
It's a mindset that's very difficult to change. Although there is some hope here, because some of the students in the concluding paragraphs of their journal stated, this is my feeling today, and I may need to change my mind if I do. So that there was a little doubt, you know, somehow, and inserting that kind of a doubt about the correctness of your bias is one of the ways to do that. It could be done. Unfortunately, you know, I wish we had more information how they interrogated these Al-Qaeda prisoners that we had. I don't think that the CIA or the military knows how to debrief these kinds of prisoners because,
Right.
again, they don't understand the culture.
Mm-hmm.
We have actually about 3 books critical of the CIA in general.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you have seen any of these too. And they are written by people who are former employees and who support CIA still,
Right, right.
and who identified 7 of the major blunders that CIA committed because they did not understand the cultures that they were dealing with.
Yeah.
So if you are looking for any evidence of the importance of the field
Mm-hmm.
and the importance of understanding culture,
Right.
that's the evidence that's
Yeah.
probably most powerful too. The other problem with the CIA was that they actually had very sophisticated training
Mm-hmm.
how to understand other cultures.
Right, right.
That gets back to some of the topics we discussed before,
Yeah.
the so-called emic
Yeah.
way of thinking, which is very difficult because most people associate, we do a lot of that kind of emic stuff, because people specialize in identifying the mindsets of criminals.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have to be a criminal to do that, although somehow people assume that you do. And the same is true of international and intercultural education. We do need to understand other culture, and we don't need to like them or agree with them.
Right.
And that's a problem because our cognitive mindset is to explain it in one way.
Mm.
It's either this way or that way, and so you need a closure on it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a cultural variable, you see.
Yes.
And it is also a cultural variable in areas that we try to develop, and there is the creative thinking.
Mm-hmm.
That's a basis of innovation.
Mm-hmm.
But most innovation is just adding something to something that's already produced.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes it more expensive and
Mm-hmm.
more complicated for people to use too. And
Yeah.
that's not necessarily innovation.
Mm.
Of the kind, that I'm thinking. Innovation is something that is a result of a synthesis of more things than one.
Yes.
All of a sudden you see something and gives you an idea,
Mm-hmm.
and so you connect the ideas that you already have.
Right.
And the more ideas you have, the more connections you have in your brain.
Yeah.
And that is how true innovation really comes
Right.
up.
Yeah.
If you want to produce, let's say, bricks,
Mm-hmm.
and you ask how would you innovate the use of bricks.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of building houses, you build fences.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's just still building, still the
Right.
same kind of thing too.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to find other ways of using the bricks then to
Mm-hmm.
have really some innovation.
So then for the faculty in particular, as they approach classes or things like that, being able to challenge the students to get outside of that, to teach thinking skills, as well as giving them cultural knowledge as well, other perspectives seems to be
The
very important.
faculty are so content-oriented that they challenge the content
Uh-huh.
and not the way of thinking about the subject.
Mm.
And that is one of the reasons why the students are not doing well on critical thinking.
Oh.
The book, what is it called? Learning in Distress or something like that. But there was a national study, applauded by everybody. Came from our former Vice President Roger Benjamin, who is now with an organization in Washington that I don't recall. So this was highly acclaimed, and expectations were great. And they basically conclude, that students are not learning very much.
Mm.
And probably would be related to this Austrian book about ignorance, because the students spend more time on television, texting, and things like that.
Sure.
The numbers that they cite in this book are really staggering.
Mm-hmm.
And it's difficult to deal with that, you know,
Sure.
because that's the easy way out for the students.
Mm-hmm.
And learning is sometimes very difficult,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes confrontative,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes very complex that people don't need to how to use.
Yeah.
So I think our faculty may do a very good job in confronting students about a particular policy or subject,
Mm-hmm.
you know, but they don't process it far enough to go into critical thinking, creative thinking, or even comparative thinking,
Mm-hmm.
to make students actually think, you know, about what they are saying, what they are writing, and what they are doing.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how to do it, because most faculty have not been trained to pedagogy of any kind. So they don't probably know what critical thinking is.
Mm-hmm.
You know, at one time, one of the organizations interested in cross-cultural communication produced some videos, and one of them was a kind of a marked-up classroom with an instructor and students who represented different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very interesting video. The instructor was trying to get the students to respond to some policy in the Antarctic. Have you seen that video?
I think I've heard about this. Yes,
Yeah,
please,
yeah. It's called The Other Knowledge or something like that. And it was, you know, obviously very artificially conducted. It was compressed into a very short amount of time. But the assumption was that the instructor was was educating students to think critically. He wasn't doing anything like that at all. You know, he was just sort of questioning them too, and then he finally concluded, well, we agree to disagree, period. That was his conclusion. And he just, you know, even the specialists in cross-cultural communications don't understand what critical thinking is, but the video was very popular and sold very well.
Yeah.
So that's the problem that we have, is that we have a lot of aids, and they are often very simple-minded. Now that's needed too, you know. I don't want to decry that too, you know, because the people who go abroad need some pretty quick introduction to these kinds of things, you know,
Sure.
and you hope that they will connect it when they go abroad, and especially when they come back. And that's part of the problem that we have. I think that I wish, for example, somebody would study this business school student a year later.
Right, come back.
You know, because when we give them a questionnaire, like many of these studies of cultural intelligence, cultural sophistication, whatever they call that, are done immediately after you return, and that's a miscalculation, because the impact is really long-term.
What happens 5 years afterwards? Does it really change the thinking?
But the long-term impact is also subject to cultural orientation.
Sure.
You know, the one study that I remember was done on the Belgians who studied in the U.S. Immediately after World War I, and we wanted to honor the participation of the Belgians in the war and their sacrifices. So this was a gesture. This was a very large number, and people apparently continued with these people, and I guess have some follow-up contacts too. And after World War II, so, you know, that was what, about 30 years or 40 years that transpired between these two events. They contacted them with another questionnaire. And the outcome of that questionnaire was very interesting. They still liked the U.S. very much. This was a great experience for them, and so on. So that was good stuff for our ears, you know.
Yeah.
But then when they were asked, they remember only the U.S. in terms of their own experience in that year.
Right.
And they showed no understanding that the country has changed so much, and what the nature of that change has been.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Dr.
Yeah.
Mestenhauser.
Okay.